President Trump's mandate to restore American greatness faces its first serious test in an unlikely state, Virginia, where Republicans are fighting to hold on to the governor's mansion. Lose here, and we put the entire America First agenda in jeopardy. Today on Restoration Spotlight. I'm Hayden Ludwig. Imagine, if you will, a campaign that never ends. The lights never go off, the hiring continues, the messaging evolves, even after Election Day comes and goes. Experts call it the permanent campaign, and it's the secret weapon the left has and the right needs to have if we want to win. So why are so many Republicans lagging behind this revolution in political affairs? The man with the answer? Virginia's own Ned Ryun, founder and CEO of American Majority Action. Ned, thank you for joining Restoration Spotlight.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Good to be back with you.
My pleasure. So coordinating voter registration, message microtargeting, early voting, all very sophisticated stuff. Ned, clearly, campaigns in 2025 aren't run like campaigns were in 2005, right?
There's been a lot that's changed, and I would like to think that American Majority Action have been a real part of this since the midterms in 22. That I think we're just focusing on doing the obvious things and doing them really well. And by that, I mean, we should focus on the underlying numbers. I think this is something that, quite frankly, been looking at what the Florida Republican Party did really between 2018 and 2025 in regards to a few things, but what they've been doing for 5, 6, 7 election cycles in regards to AB, EV projects. So let me explain the first thing. If anybody is really paying attention, they've probably noticed that Florida is no longer a battleground state. Why is that? Well, now there's 1.3 million more registered Republicans than Democrats in the state. Seismic shift from even 2020, in which there were almost, I think it was almost about 100,000 more registered Democrats in Florida in 2020 elections. And now it's 1.3 million more Republicans. How'd that happen?
Wow.
Well, they decided they were going to actually focus on the fundamentals, the numbers that lead to numbers. And by that, I mean, two of the most important numbers to me in any given state are, what is your partisan registration advantage? And how big is your ballot universe compared to the other side? And Republicans really did a fantastic job in Florida of AB, EV for the last 15 years. In fact, won the overwhelming majority of statewide races in what was a pretty significantly partisan Democrat state. And then obviously the tides turned when in 2018 they decided year in and year out they were going to invest in the fundamentals of voter registration, absentee ballot generation, replacing some of the county clerks. You got to give Ron DeSantis props for that, especially in the southeast counties that are key to that state, replacing the county clerks to clean voter rolls. And then once you've done all those numbers, obviously in those last 6 weeks when ballots drop in Florida, doing the absentee ballot chase and the early vote push. And so it was a year in, year out investment, I'd say, for the last 7 years, and they're continuing to do it and widen the advantage in regards to partisan registration. And it's something I want to see happen in a lot of these other battleground states between now and 2028. I mean, how great would it be if we turned Arizona into Florida, or Nevada into Florida, or Virginia into Florida? I think it's one of those things that we want to get people to focus on. This isn't the last 6 months before an election. It's not even the election year. It's what are you doing in the previous 3, 4, 5 years to fundamentally change those underlying numbers that I think prep the battlefield for you to be successful when the elections come around.
Okay, so there's a lot of people who are watching where this is going to be a sea change in thinking about how elections are even run. So just run through a couple of things. AB, absentee balloting, or EV, early voting, not electric vehicles, early voting here. We've called this the permanent campaign. That's a term that you have popularized. It's a big deal. Give us from the 30,000-foot perspective how the permanent campaign model of winning elections differs on a grand scale from the traditional model.
I mean, traditionally, I've been around a long time, much longer than I'd like to admit. It used to be the 72-hour task force, where you'd go in those last 72 hours before the elections, and you would push out as many people as possible on election day to try and boost the vote and win that way. Well, the rules have changed considerably since that time. Let's say that was 2004, right? The 2004 presidential, the 72-hour task force. You're just hammering on phones and doors and all these things to get people to the polls on election day. Well, the rules have changed. The rules now are very heavily focused on mail-in, early voting now. A lot of states, Florida, Virginia, they've got 42 to 45 days of early voting.
45 days of early voting. So September.
Yeah. In September 19th is when the ballots drop and early voting begins. In certain locations, it's not across every polling location here in Virginia, but it's September 19th here in Virginia when early voting and the ballots drop. So, in Arizona, it's about 30 days. Ballots dropped October 9th last year in 2024 in Arizona. So a lot of states typically have 30 to 40 some days of ballot chase and early voting period in which you've got an opportunity. And I have to confess, do I want 12 hours or do I want 45 days to turn out the mid to low prop Republicans who you're not really sure are going to actually turn out on election day? I'll take the 45 days,
of course,
every time, because it gives me the ability to persuade these people to turn out and vote. And it's one of those things that I think this is the difference. And the other seismic shift you've seen in elections is this. It used to be low turnout elections favored Republicans. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think the case is we have to have high turnout elections actually favor Republicans. And so it becomes one of those things where we've got to boost the numbers, build out those underlying numbers, and then really hammer home in those last 45 days here in Virginia, getting out those mid to low props to boost the overall turnout as high as possible. The higher the turnout goes, the better chance Republicans have in actually winning.
So, obviously the skeptics, especially since 2020, and I think very understandably, look at it and go, well, what's wrong with in-person voting on election day as opposed to voting early in person or voting absentee?
Well, I will say this. Last year, Donald Trump, I think 50% of our success last year was Donald Trump saying it's fine to request a ballot. It's fine to vote by mail. It's fine to vote early in person. It's fine to vote in person on election day. Just have a plan. And the point I've been making really since after the midterms in 22 is that these are the rules of the game. The rules of the game are there's going to be absentee ballots, I think, for the foreseeable future. And I'd like to say I'm working on parallel paths. I would love to see election day only voting, photo ID, all of these great things, very limited early in-person voting, very limited, very highly restricted ability to request a ballot. That's my aspirational path. The reality is the rules of the game are probably not going to change anytime soon, in which you're going to have absentee ballots. You're going to have 45 days of early voting. And so my argument has been, let's play the game by the rules. And if you don't like the rules, you have to win the game by the current rules. And once we've won the game, maybe we can have a conversation about those rules. But I'll be honest, if we can use the current rules to send the un-American left into the political wilderness for a generation or two, guess what? I'm going to keep playing by these rules.
What's the current voter registration gap in Virginia, which of course does not record party affiliation, but using your latest numbers between Republicans and Democrats?
Yeah, we don't do partisan registration here. We do modeling, and based off the most recent modeling, modeled Republicans were down about 251,000 to the modeled Democrats, which interestingly, if you look back at the November 5th election results here in Virginia, that's almost exactly the margin of victory by Kamala Harris here in Virginia over Donald J. Trump. It's about 250,000. If you look at the ballot universe, I think we're down 339,000 on the permanent absentee ballot list here in Virginia. Again, all modeled or perceived Republicans versus modeled perceived Democrats. But those are troubling numbers for me. Being a resident here in Loudoun County, the underlying numbers in Virginia, clearly there's not been the investment made into trying to build those out at industrial levels, right? We've done some work in the field, but when I talk industrial levels, we're talking 7 figures worth being invested into voter registration, 7 figures being invested into absentee ballot generation. So there's a lot of work that I think needs to be done in Virginia if we're going to be successful moving forward in a consistent way, right? Obviously, 2021, Glenn Youngkin, we won all the statewide. We took the House of Delegates back.
Yeah.
But the odds are stacked against us because of those underlying numbers.
So in other words, we have between 250 and let's call it 350,000 vote gap that the models say between the Republicans and Democrats, meaning if every Republican and every Democrat turned out, we could expect to lose roughly by 250,000 or so votes, putting it very simplistically, but that's the model. Now, that would strongly suggest that even if we pushed for in-person voting on election day, you've got 45 days of Democrats banking votes. There's not enough time on a single day, on a single Tuesday, to bank enough votes to overcome that advantage.
That's right. Not even close. And for us to do that, and something that we were doing in a lot of different states except for Florida in 2022, you're going to find yourself, you're going to find the other team on second base, rounding second, going to third by the time you even get off of home plate. And you find yourself so far behind if you're not playing the game by the current rules that it became one of those things where it just felt like we were fighting with one hand tied behind our back. And enough's enough. And it's one of those things that I think is just fundamental to how we need to approach politics moving forward. I'm a big believer that politics is policy, that you have to win politically to be in the right place to implement policy. And the important thing that we need to be focused on, to the point of almost being obsessive, I would argue, how do you gain political power? How do you maintain your hold on political power for as long as possible to have the right people in the right place implementing the right policy? But if you're not investing in the right numbers that lead to political power, it really is a game of chance. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is remove as much chance as possible by focusing on those numbers, those correct numbers, and then focusing on making sure the absentee ballot and the early vote push are robustly funded to maximize those numbers you've been building off, hopefully for multiple years before the actual chase and early vote push began.
Now, your organization, American Majority Action, was deeply involved in the April 2025 Wisconsin Supreme Court race. I want to use this as a parallel because that was a race where the Republicans, at least officially, outspent the Democrats, which is extraordinarily rare. When you look at the hard dollars, I'm saying. That's not taking into account any of the registration, et cetera. But let's stick to that point for a moment here. Clearly, the last-minute $7+ million, multi-million-dollar investments into TV ads that were done in the waning days of March didn't bring us over the finish line. We lost by about 10 points or so. What lessons does that provide for people who still are holding to the older model, Ned, of we just need to outspend the Democrats and get more TV ads to counter Abigail Spanberger in the governor's race here in Virginia?
Well, I would argue in Wisconsin, Schimmel was getting absolutely pounded for weeks and weeks and weeks before he was able to even go on the air. It really, the fundamental politics 101 is if you can define your opponent before he or she can define themselves, the odds are you're probably going to win. And I think in many ways, Schimmel was defined in a negative light before he even had the chance to respond. And the point I'll make about all of that, it's still important. It's extremely important that we do not lose sight of the battle of defining, making sure that there's enough investment into the TV and radio space so that when it comes time for the AB EV push, you're close enough that you can win. Because I will be fully transparent and honest on this part. You're not going to come from 10 points down with the most spectacular AB EV push. You've got to be within 2, 3, maybe 4 points for that to be successful, for you to find that victory in the margins. And so I think one of the lessons I took from the spring Supreme Court race in Wisconsin this spring was we probably should have been running a lot more TV and radio, maybe even in December on behalf of Schimmel.
That's right.
Much earlier on in that the left really stole a march on us. And so I think if we're going to be successful, I believe it's next spring, there's another spring Supreme Court election. I would argue probably need to start running TV and radio ads in December for that April election.
In other words, the permanent campaign model says the day after the November presidential election, you're not just partying on a champagne high, you're starting for the next election already. And that's the big thing. You can't do that last minute, right?
No, you can't. And this is the one fun. So let me explain even a deeper philosophical reason for why I'm doing this in the permanent campaign and what I consider a year in, year out struggle. We're up against a bunch of religious zealots, right? The progressive left, politics is their religion, they're religious zealots, the administrative state is their holy of holies. For them, this is a fundamental belief issue. And so they're religious zealots. Too many times we have been careerists, where we'll show up, we'll have a great career in DC or wherever else we're going to be for 20 years and we'll move on. Whereas these religious zealots are organizing 24/7, 365 days a year for political power so they can be in the right place to implement their vision, a very deeply corrupted and twisted worldview vision for this country. And they are intent on fundamental change, but it's something where they've wired themselves where it's day in, day out, a religious quest And for conservatives and those on the center right, for us, politics is kind of a necessary evil. But unless we start to change our mindset and go, we have to meet their religious zealotry with our own passion, you're going to lose. And
Yeah.
so it's one of those things where I'm like, we have to rise to the occasion and understand. I would argue, I have a 5-year plan, right? My 5-year plan from 2025 to 2030 is that we focus on the 26 elections, the 28 elections, and the 2030 elections. 26 to make sure that Donald Trump doesn't get impeached. So we got to keep the House. I feel pretty optimistic about the Senate. You got to keep the White House in 28. And then in 2030, the census numbers kick in. And this is one thing that I'm becoming somewhat obsessed with, in which even if the census numbers that are corrupted at this moment, it still shows 13 electoral votes moving into red states to give 13 more House seats as well. I think if we can work on this mass deportation and making sure the census numbers aren't corrupted, you might have 25 plus electoral votes and House seats moving south into these red states. And so it's one of those things where I'm like, for the next 5 years, we better be passionate about every day thinking about how we're going to build out our partisan registration numbers, how we're going to build out our ballot universe numbers, and then in election seasons of 26, 28, and 30, maximizing those numbers to make sure we hold on to political power for as long as possible. Because I have to tell you, not only do I think we have to do this for the restoration of the republic, but it's one of those things where I think at a very basic level, we should never allow the feral and animalistic left to have political power, because I think at that point, all bets are off.
Well, speaking of religious zealots, and I am a religious zealot, it just so happens to be, let's talk about the role of Christians in this election. As of recording, one of the most recent major accomplishments, though it's very understated, of the Trump administration is the role in the IRS backing off the Johnson Amendment. Now, if you don't know, the Johnson Amendment, of course, goes back to the 1950s, and it basically is used to gag nonprofits, 501c3 nonprofits, from political intervention. Up until now, 2025, that has been used to stop pastors from speaking out politically in the pulpit. Well, the IRS just clarified that, in fact, speaking out on behalf of or against a candidate running for federal office is not a violation of the Johnson Amendment. In other words, churches can now involve themselves in elections. Ned, I know this is early, but what effect will this have on turning out the Christian vote, let's say over the next 4 or 5 years?
I hope a significant one. But I will say this. My concern is that there is a lot of progressivism that has entered evangelical churches. I say this as an evangelical,
yes,
that you do see this progressive influence in which I'm not fully convinced that this will be overall of benefit unless we focus on the Trinitarian churches, the ones that actually believe in the Bible and practical application of Scripture to the world around us. Those are the churches that I want to see more actively engage in politics. But I will also say this. One of the dynamics that has troubled me about Christians not being involved is I think they miss the totality of if Christ is to be over every aspect of life, it's like they're like, well, it'll be over family and health and education, but not politics. Politics is a dirty business. We shouldn't be. Well, either there's the totality of Christ over all aspects or there's not. And I think in many ways, this is one thing that I think has been sorely lacking in evangelical churches of like, he is to be in every aspect of your life. And if he is not in every aspect of your life, there might be something wrong with how you're applying your faith to the totality of your life. And so I hope that we see more of the Trinitarian churches rising to the occasion. I hope that those preaching from the pulpit understand the responsibility that they have to actually preach the gospel and also preach that totality that is Christ is to be in every aspect of our life, including politics, and that we are to apply scriptural principles to how we are voting. And if we see candidates and policies that are not in alignment with Scripture, you should not be voting for that person or for that advancement of policy. And so how do you actually get the involvement of Christians to align with scriptural principles and then get pastors from the pulpit to actually advocate for candidates and policies and encouraging their congregations to be salt and light in every aspect of this world, including politics?
Well, there was a time not that long ago, just a few generations ago, when Christians would say only Christians should be involved in running for office. We can't trust a non-Christian to an atheist, for instance, to be president of the United States or to be my representative. That's always been an understanding up until maybe the 1950s, 1960s.
Well, I will say this. The thing that is always perplexing to me is that you go back and look at just the foundational principles of this country. The Declaration and Constitution codified a set of values and principles and belief that the people at that time held, right?
That's
Transcendent
right.
creator, natural inherent rights that were given to you by that transcendent creator. Governments were not meant to give rights. Governments were meant to secure rights. But I just want to remind people the ideals and principles in our Declaration and Constitution simply codified the belief system of the founding era. And that founding era was very much a Judeo-Christian, Anglo-American worldview, set of values and principles. And so if you are actually having people in office that don't buy into those sets of principles and ideals, that's where you start to see a country and a government fracture and start to go in all different kinds of crazy directions. And so I would argue for a full and complete restoration of the republic and the constitutional republic, representative democracy. We have to go back and have a conversation about what is that common set of views and ideals and principles that we as a culture and society buy into? Because I think we've lost our way dramatically on that front.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that made America great in the first place is for the first time in human history, you had one continent peopled from coast to coast by a people that spoke the same language and had the same God.
Right.
And we've really lost a lot of that, including the language, by the way. I grew up in California. I can tell you all the signs in Spanish. It's still true in Virginia now. It's remarkable.
It is.
We're losing that cohesion.
We are. And that's why you begin to see what I call the balkanization of this country, in which you fracture out, African American, whatever, into these different sets and demographics, and then you have really racial politics. There's a whole host of things that have come from this, and I think it's obviously from a Marxist ideology that is meant to fracture this country. I mean, you can go back and talk about the beginnings of CRT and all that stuff. But I think this is one of the things that I really want to have a conversation as we're coming into the 250th anniversary of this country. Who are we as a people? What made us a great nation? And how do we climb to even greater heights of freedom and prosperity? Well, we have to go back and look at our foundational principles and renew them again. And I say this all the time. I'm not really a conservative per se. I'm a restorationist, because I think conservative is way too much of a defensive term. How do we talk about restoring those values, those principles, truly restoring the republic, truly restoring representative government? I think you have to go back and have that conversation about the founding ideals of this country that are codified in our founding documents.
You're speaking my language. Going back to Virginia and early voting for a moment, let's talk about the early voting gap. So in 2021, Glenn Youngkin ran the Secure Your Vote campaign, which is exactly what you and American majority want in a lot of respects about early voting and absentee balloting, right? Now, this is on the heels of the 2020 election, so it's a big deal to start to change Republicans' minds about how we go about voting. Now, he's been doing that consistently through the 2022 midterms, the 2023 House and Senate elections here in Virginia, 2024 presidential election. The numbers that I've seen have shown that the gap between early votes cast by Democrats, likely Democrats and likely Republicans, has shrunk dramatically, maybe down to single digits at this point. So clearly, if that's correct, we're on a good trajectory. Where does that set us up for 2025, moving into the 2028 presidential election, do you think?
I'll be honest, looking at the numbers, I'm not terribly optimistic about Virginia this year. I think we've got a lot of hard work in front of us. I think it's going to be very hard at the statewide level, those statewide offices, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general. I do like Miari's chances. I'm not as optimistic about the other two. And we're really focused on 15 different House of Delegate races here with American Majority Action. But I have to tell you right now, I could see us picking up 2 seats and taking the majority. I could see us losing 4 seats and being down 10 seats in the House of Delegates. So I think we're in for a dogfight. I think there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done between now and November. And I think we've made steps in the right direction. But I would say we'll see how this turns out in November. But I will also make the argument, again, going back to those early numbers that I discussed, we're down by 250,000 perceived Republicans versus Democrats in voter registration. We're down almost 340,000 in the ballot universe. We've made strides, but there's a lot of ground that still needs to be made up.
Now, reaching all of those voters, registering them, getting them to nagging them until they turn in their ballots or vote early, right? This costs
Targeted
money.
harassment.
Targeted harassment, exactly. Yeah, your other title, chief target harasser, I guess.
That's right.
Talk to me about the economics of all of this. How much does it cost, for instance, to start doing that now in July versus the day before the election?
Well, it really will center around September 19th, the minute the ballots drop and the minute early voting begins. In regards to the dollar cost average between someone voting on, say, the first couple days of early voting and returning their ballot versus I'm not going to vote until election day or I'm not going to return my ballot until the last few days. We've really come up with kind of the economics of early voting. If you vote in that first couple days, when the ballots drop or early voting begins, you're probably going to cost us about $10 a ballot. Okay, not bad. That's going to be, some doors. It's going to be some phones. If you wait until election day, you're going to cost us about $100 for your ballot.
10 times more.
10 times more because we're not going to stop. We're going to look at your ballot, you as a voter, and go, you've got to get out. It's a critical election. We're not going to stop with door knocks. We're not going to stop with live calls. We're not going to stop with postcard reminders or peer-to-peer texting. So you're costing us money. And so what we want people to do is go, the minute early voting begins or my ballot is received, you return it or you go vote day one. And that's what my wife and now my oldest son is a registered voter. We go first day of early voting, we vote in person, get that vote banked so that people won't focus on us anymore. They're not going to waste phone calls or anything else on us. So they can then take those resources and target the other, some mid to low propensity voters to try and get them to the polls. So the longer you hold on to your ballot, the longer you refuse to vote, you're costing us a lot more money. And last time I checked, money doesn't grow on trees. So I encourage people, help us economize the coins that we have to be as effective as possible. Get out and vote as soon as possible so we can target on, those mid to low props that might be a little harder to get to the polls.
Yeah, and give them more coins to work with, too. If you guys live in Virginia or you have family do, mark September 19th. That is the day to vote. Ned, as we close out here, I want to talk about the Earl Sears campaign for governor and Jason Miyares rerunning for attorney general. Now, the fear on the right, and it's unfortunately a well-founded one, is that Glenn Youngkin had a fluke victory in 2021. He won by 66,000 votes out of, I think, about 3.2 million that were cast. That's very, very tight. And obviously, people who are following it are familiar with some of the very big mistakes that the Terry McAuliffe made around schools and transgenderism, parents' rights, et cetera. Well, in the last 4 years, Winsome Sears has run on a lot of great issues. I mean, nixing the grocery tax was a big 2021 campaign promise. There's the world's first commercial fusion nuclear power plant that's being built near where I live outside Richmond. $1 billion in tax relief, mass deportations of illegal aliens, ending DEI in schools. I mean, there's a pretty good laundry list here. Nevertheless, how do we actually weaponize those to reach people and convince Republicans to turn out and moderates to turn out for Winsome? Tough question, I know.
Well, it starts with the fundamentals of actually running a good campaign. So I'm happy to see that Winsome has done a little bit of a campaign shakeup. Had real questions about some of the senior leadership over there. But yeah, it's one of those things where I think some of these are pretty obvious issues to be talking about. Especially there's a couple other issues. Car tax is a huge issue.
It is.
There's another issue too where, the left constitutional amendment wants to basically enshrine late-term abortions here in the state. There's also something about rehabilitating felons to give them the right to vote again. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on.
Including violent felons, yes.
Including violent felons that I think it's ripe fruit. It's ripe for the picking. And I'm a little confused as to why they're not hammering on those issues that I think are pretty critical issues for the future of this state. So a little confused as to how the campaigns are being run. I think Winsome is up against it. Last poll I saw, she's down 10. Jason, I think, is down 6. I'm quietly optimistic that Jason is going to be a very, very competitive race. Being honest, my goal for election night is that we hold the attorney general seat and we somehow sneak out 2 pickups in the House of Delegates for 51-49 majority. And if we get that, I'll be thrilled.
That would be huge. Well, Ned Ryun, thank you so much for your time and insights today.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm Hayden Ludwig, and this is Restoration Spotlight, a project of Restoration News, your source of headline-smashing investigative journalism for the America First movement. Check us out at restoration-news.com. And until next time, stay vigilant and trust in God.